Hi, this is Bill Prater, and welcome to the Business Builder Show, where we feature champions in their respective industries from all over the planet. Our mission is to bring you timely, provocative, and actionable resources designed to inspire, promote, and accelerate your quest for business excellence. Today, we're going to find out why Memtin can treat a specific subgroup of Alzheimer's disease patients. We'll find out how with Nik Tezapsidis. Now, Nik is the founder and chief executive officer of Neurotez and has filled those roles since the company was founded back in 2005. He's led the company in developing a human leptin product called Memtin, and it's a hormone replacement therapy for certain Alzheimer patients. Nik, it's great to have you here, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity.
So what we're going to do is we're going to find out who you serve, and then when we finish describing that area, then we'll move into some of the lessons you've learned as an entrepreneur. Starting out, so when I ask you, who do you serve, I'd like you to answer in a broad fashion, because I know that you've got several stakeholders that are involved in your enterprise. So who do you serve, Nik?
First and utmost, we would like to serve that specific subgroup of Alzheimer's patients that you mentioned. That's the most important stakeholder group that we would like to serve. And obviously, as a for-profit company, we would like to serve our shareholders and anyone that offered their services, their time, and their work to build this company and bring it to the stage that it is right now. So first the patients and then the shareholders.
Patients and then the shareholders. Excellent. Describe the problems that you've identified, Nik, you and your company, and that you're going about solving.
So Alzheimer's disease is a huge unmet medical need. We have had some tremendous problems coming up with a drug that is meaningful for Alzheimer's patients. There have been plenty of attempts in the last 20 years. Recently, there have been a few approvals by the FDA of drugs with limited clinical benefit. And these are drugs, although they are moving at the right direction, there's ample of room for improvement in terms of safety, in terms of efficacy, in terms of cost, and route of administration. It's not the most user-friendly type of drug for Alzheimer's patients. We have been working on a novel approach that involves Memtin, as you mentioned, which is an analog of human leptin. And this is based on years of preclinical work conducted by our company and has been confirmed by other groups around the globe, not affiliated with Neurotez, and clinical observations that support strongly an association of low leptin levels and risk for Alzheimer's disease, or low leptin levels and degree of dementia in Alzheimer's patients. So the idea is we will be targeting as early stage as possible Alzheimer's cases with low leptin levels. And because an early stage of Alzheimer's is not necessarily, with early stage Alzheimer's is not necessarily predetermined who will convert to full-blown Alzheimer's and also at what rate, we will select individuals that have a genetic predisposition for Alzheimer's disease based on a genetic test we will be conducting with a partner in the UK called Cytox. They have a method to provide a polygenic risk score that the higher that score is, the more likely you're going to get Alzheimer's disease. So genetically predisposed individuals with low leptin levels at the earliest stages possible will be the ideal subgroup of Alzheimer's cases that we intend to target. And it's a de-risked approach. Leptin has been in the market for a different indication, for generalized lipodystrophy. Nonetheless, it is a drug that has a proven safety profile, a documented safety profile. So it is a de-risked approach. And we know, other than safety, we have all the data required about route of administration, dosage, which incidentally may have to be adjusted for the Alzheimer population that we're going to be targeting, as most of the use of the current drug in generalized lipodystrophy was targeting a younger population. Generalized lipodystrophy is something that is affecting the younger, genetically predisposed individuals. It's an extreme lipodystrophy, lipid abnormality disorder, characterized by insulin resistance, et cetera, et cetera. So why leptin for Alzheimer's? Why is this novel? We don't necessarily think that either A beta or phospho-tau, which are biomarkers of the disease, are necessarily the culprit of the disease. They're very important biomarkers, and they're very useful in not only detecting as early as possible, even at pre-symptomatic stages, Alzheimer's cases, but nonetheless, we don't necessarily think that they are the driving force of neurodegeneration. And the failure of all trials so far targeting those biomarkers are actual proof that they can't be culprits. We believe that Alzheimer's disease is a metabolic disorder of the brain. Leptin, as determined by preclinical work that we did in our laboratory and confirmed by other groups, has targets that are upstream of A beta and phospho-tau. And we have demonstrated that leptin treatment does modulate levels of A beta and phospho-tau. So we anticipate in our clinical trials to see not only decreased levels of A beta and phospho-tau, which will be secondary biomarkers or endpoints, but also either stabilization of cognitive decline, as leptin has been demonstrated to have pro-cognitive properties based on animal models that we use in preclinical studies. So that's in a nutshell. So essentially now we're in the middle of fundraising to secure the funds needed for the clinical trials.
So what round of fundraising are you in now?
It will be Series A.
Series A, okay.
Will be Series A. So far we were successful in raising funds from non-dilutive sources, NIH, primarily through SBIR mechanisms, small amounts from private investors through crowdfunding mechanisms, and
Okay.
yeah.
So we'll get into more of that. It just popped in my brain, but I want to explore that a little bit, particularly when you mentioned crowdfunding and things like that. Nik, I'm thinking that our listeners might be able to understand maybe a simulated case study. What pops into my mind is, what's the catalyst? How's the caregiver going to know to order up a test, et cetera? Could you kind of walk us through how you envision the process from diagnosis to therapy taking place?
As I mentioned, the field has advanced tremendously in being able to diagnose Alzheimer's cases using biomarkers, even at pre-symptomatic stages.
Okay.
And overall, this is a fantastic opportunity for drug developers to identify treatments that could be beneficial to stop the progression of the disease. So we may be able to see at a very early stage, and usually people will undergo diagnostic tests of that nature, measurements of biomarkers, when there's a slight indication that either memory is failing a little bit, or there's some cognitive deficits emerging as we age, etc. And people get alerted. Is this normal aging, which is primarily associated with some memory loss and cognitive decline? But with Alzheimer's disease, this decline and deterioration is much more profound. It is a disease, yes, associated with aging, but Alzheimer's disease is a disease. So if we are in a position to identify these very early stages of Alzheimer's disease using biomarkers, and ideally find a treatment that will halt the progression, It may not necessarily be the cure, but what I mean by cure ultimately is to reverse totally any cognitive decline that may have occurred over time. If we stop the progression, that will be the absolutely perfect, ideal solution for the problem. And for that problem to unfold, ideally, again, diagnosis is going to be very important. Now, with leptin, our program specifically, it has been demonstrated that individuals, elderly, with low leptin levels, and specifically a study done by Boston University's Shisadri at the time, showed that elderly individuals with leptin levels at the lower quartile were 4 times more likely to get Alzheimer's disease 10, 12 years down the road. So these are cognitively normal individuals that were screened for their leptin levels, and was demonstrated with follow-up longitudinal study that if they had low leptin, they were at risk of getting Alzheimer's disease. So if we identify individuals as exactly what we proposed, as I proposed in the beginning, that are genetically predisposed, and everyone these days is doing 23andMe, they're getting their DNA sequence, et cetera. If we apply, and I don't know how far Cytox has gone with incorporating their algorithm in any of the big DNA sequencing companies, but ideally that we could have DNA sequence and a genetic test for Alzheimer's, specifically incorporating all those single nucleotide polymorphisms that Cytox is working with. So everyone will get a polygenic risk score for Alzheimer's. So if we have that situation where, you have a high risk for Alzheimer's, and at some point you measure your leptin levels and they're low, you're the perfect candidate for a leptin treatment. Now, we will not be able to cure or treat all Alzheimer's cases. Not everyone is going to have that leptin deficiency. It is a good portion of Alzheimer's disease. By analyzing the data from ADNI, we identified that 70% of MCIs, mild cognitively impaired individuals, had leptin levels lower than the median in the normal population.
Okay, so it's a significant subgroup.
Correct. That said, the ideal candidate will not be those that are simply just lower than the median. If we are very aggressive, we'll focus on the lower quartile. And that would be probably a smaller population. And that said, if leptin is safe and well tolerated over long periods of time, people even with slightly lower leptin levels may consider undergoing that treatment.
Okay, interesting. Nik, you've mentioned funding sources and so forth and so on. So I know this next question you've had to answer over and over again, but I want to know, how are you different from your competition out there?
If we consider competition, the companies that recently got their drug approved, it's a fairly easy one. I mentioned that those drugs have ample of room for improvement in terms of safety. They're associated with brain edema and microbleeding. With efficacy, the maximum they can achieve is only a 25% decline in deterioration of cognition. Cost, they're very expensive. It costs $26,000 per year, and that does not include monitoring and imaging that will be required to evaluate the clinical benefit of the drug, and route of administration. They have to go for an infusion every 2 or 3 months. I can't remember exactly the timeline, that involves the patient going into the clinic to receive an infusion for hours. It's by no means an ideal solution for the problem. So in our case, we know it's safe based on clinical data. Since 2014, there hasn't been a single severe adverse event reported for any of the patients receiving leptin. And these patients will be receiving higher doses. We anticipate lowering the dose because elderly metabolize proteins, and we assume leptin at a much lower rate. So we're going to need a smaller dose. Efficacy, as I mentioned, if we are fortunate to identify individuals at the early stage and halt the progression, that's the ideal situation. That's what we aim to achieve or demonstrate in clinical trials. And in terms of cost, it will be probably a quarter, if not a third, of the price that is currently the cost for the current treatment. And route of administration, although it is an injectable, it is something that can easily be administered by the patient itself instead of at home, instead of having to go to the clinic for the infusion. The injectable pens these days people use, you probably heard about GLP-1 sprays, and of course, I know overall the Americans do not like injectables. There's been a tremendous effort, for example, in GLP-1 drugs to find an oral version, or at least a formulation that would allow monthly or 6 monthly type of injection instead of daily injections or weekly injections that it is currently. So similar efforts will be obviously something that we will do in the second generation of leptin treatment, but we will have to do the daily injectable version right now for practical reasons. The improvement will happen in the second generation.
Excellent. You've done a super job, Nik, for our listeners of explaining something very complex and new to them as well. So thank you very much. Now, what I'd like to do is have you change hats, put on your business builder's hat, and walk us through, where'd you come up with this idea? How did you start the company? Where did you find your key employees and contractors? What mistakes did you make? What lessons did you learn? Just tell us the story.
As you well know, you need funding to support all the activities associated with drug development. Whether you're doing it under the hat of a non-profit academic institution or under the hat of a for-profit company, the costs are more or less the same. You still have to undergo certain steps that are not cheap. That you need to find the fuel to undertake these studies. The early stage portion of drug development is usually done particularly with entrepreneurs that are starting a business. It usually is done, like we have done, with grants. It is probably the best source, and we were fortunate in being successful in getting grant money from the NIH. It's the most likely source for the beginning entrepreneur for money, because they're the ones that will take the higher risk projects and fund them. It won't be the VC or the private equity groups or the hedge funds that later provide funds for companies at later stages. Preclinical or work was done with the use of grants money. We soon after, and that enabled us not only to conduct the research, but also publish it in scientific journals, also apply for patents. And that's very important when you build a company, to have strong intellectual property surrounding your technology. And it's the basis that would allow investors, private investors, to support your company in later stages. The later stages are usually associated with higher requirements for funds, something you can't get from non-profit sources or like NIH or even non-profit foundations. You will have to go to the VC community. You have to go to the private equity groups, family offices, high net worth individuals, entities that will be in a position to write those bigger checks. And there we have been struggling a little bit. The conversion from the preclinical to clinical is the toughest phase of any entrepreneur starting this kind of business. I was fortunate to surround the company with individuals that had experience in the academic field, with much more experience than myself in the field of Alzheimer's disease, and also individuals that had deep knowledge and experience from the biotechnology and biopharmaceutical industry, and with experiences in drug development from all phases, from phase 1 to 4. So the company has both the scientific, academic, and business experience individuals to lead this effort forward. That said, as soon as we secure funding, we will need to add additional people for the company to move forward with the clinical trials. A major portion of our efforts was also conducted by a CRO. For example, we had to find a way to manufacture clinical grade protein. That was done by an external CRO with whom we worked for years, and we now have in our hands a GMP level master cell bank that will allow us to move into a GMP suite and produce the recombinant protein. That also absorbed a considerable portion of our funds. Anything that we did outside the company through outsourcing activity was much more expensive, obviously. And so that's anything we could do ourselves, we did ourselves. We have laboratories, we did the research. We also collaborated with a couple of academic institutes. Some of the studies were done at Case Western University, some of the animal studies. So you use everything you have in terms of your contacts in the industry, contacts in the scientific field, and it's a group effort, really.
Imagine. Yeah. So what, Nick, would you say were the 3 biggest lessons you learned over the last 20 years in this process of yours?
Don't do it. Don't do it unless you have a clear path for securing the funding. It's to be the most severe inhibiting factor, not having the funds needed to move forward, and it's frustrating. If, however, you are the type of person that will give up easily, that's another reason why you shouldn't be doing this. You have to be persistent. You have to have the funding aside, you have to have a clear vision as to how you'll go from A to B to C. And the human bringing together the right people is absolutely phenomenally important. You can't do it yourself. You have to have the right support, both in human resources and ultimately funding. But for us, funding has been a little bit of a challenge. Perhaps it's very, I mean, even now I am, and as a group, as a whole, we're trying very hard to find the right sources for funding, but that has been the hurdle for us.
So you mentioned vision earlier, Nick. So I imagine you keep refreshing your vision. How far in the future do you tend to put it? 10 years, 15, a quarter century? How far out is your vision?
Believe it or not, drug development has a very much structured path and timeline as you go from phase 1 to phase 2, phase 3. And in our particular case, each drug or medical device or treatment may have different paths and timelines associated with it. In our case, for example, we may be able to conduct successfully a phase 2 trial and then argue with the FDA for an accelerated approval path that would allow us to enter the market and test further the drug under a phase 4 post-marketing study. If that's not permitted, we will have to do a phase 3 trial. We anticipate being able, from the date we secure the funding, to complete a phase 2 in 2 to 3 years. And at that point, we're going to know, following interaction with the FDA, we can go in the market or need to do a phase 3, which will be another 2-3 years. So the worst case scenario, actually, it's a good case scenario, assuming all trials are successful, will be 5, maybe more years to the market if we need to do a phase 3. Or earlier, if we can get the accelerated approval path by the FDA.
Not that I want you to be a betting man, but probability-wise, what do you see the odds between accelerated versus traditional path?
Most of the drugs currently, the FDA is considering the accelerated approval because the Alzheimer's disease is an unmet medical need. Even with the drugs that have been approved recently, we all know that have very limited clinical benefit. Most drugs, as long as they're safe, and there is some proof that they are efficacious, and what I mean by that is a proof of concept, a small scale phase 2. If the phase 2 shows that there is some clinical benefit, it's very likely we're going to get accelerated approval.
Okay, great. Good to hear.
Yeah.
So in addition to funding, what would you say is your top 1 or 2 barriers right now?
Funding, number 1, number 2, number 3, because we have a clear path and vision as to where the drug can go. We need to get the drug in our hands, but this is part of the process going to the clinical trials. Our CMO, Dr. Ashford, was ready to start a clinical trial at Stanford University. He's one of our member of the management team and also still in academia. We had a clinical trial approved by the IRB board at Stanford University, ready to start clinical trials, but we didn't have the drug in our hands. We tried to get it from the owners, but because the drug itself was targeting an extra orphan drug indication, and it was associated with a price tag of $600,000 per patient per year, the business proposition for a partnership was not easy. We were targeting a common disease, and the drug is in the market for an extra orphan drug indication. The price tag now actually, I think, is more than 600. It's over $1 million, I think. And it's crazy because it's a drug that can be produced in bacteria, meaning they can be produced relatively cheaply compared to any of the antibodies that are produced, for example, in eukaryotic cells. So we were not able to, in other words, seal a partnership with any of the owners of the myolept, as it is known in the market, the human leptin. If we had that, probably we would have had some data from Stanford University.
It occurs to me that there's a variety of kinds of listeners listening to us, and we'll listen to our recording down the road here a bit. What's the best way for various individuals to get a hold of you, Nik?
Email would be the best.
Okay. And that is what?
Because, TEZAPSIDIS at neurotez.com.
Okay.
And some information can be found at our website, neurotez.com.
And you're on LinkedIn, as I remember.
Yes.
LinkedIn.
Yeah.
So there's another source.
Cool.
Excellent. Tell me, I'm wondering if maybe there's a question, Nik, that you were thinking, gee, I wonder when Bill's going to get around to asking me such and such a question. So is there a question that maybe you thought I should have asked that would give a great value to our listeners? And if there is one of those questions, what is it? And then what's the answer to it, Nik?
Nik, do you want me to introduce you to some of my high net worth individuals that might be interested in.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, so let's explore that a little bit there, actually. Has your difficulty been, Nick, identifying investors, getting them to say yes, combination thereof? What are the barriers you're facing that either I or another of our listeners might be able to lend you a helping hand?
The difficulties that we had when we're pitching to a variety of groups
Okay.
originally was the fact that we were focusing on Alzheimer's disease. Back before any approval was made by the FDA, and this is just a year or two ago, a lot of investor groups, before I even get into the details of our approach, when I said we were working with Alzheimer's disease, they'd go, "Oops, nope, not for us."
Okay. Okay.
There was a because of the repetitive failures in the field over a period of 20 years. There had been one failure after, even at phase 3, the late stage clinical trials. So a lot of VC groups walked away from the field altogether, and including a lot of biopharmaceutical companies. A few did stick with it, and they ended up with, as I mentioned, approval. This is Biogen and Eli Lilly. And there might be others on their way in the same category. So that was the number one hurdle. The numbers before that, when we actually had people listening to our story, were a little bit surprised that we're working with leptin itself. They were puzzled because leptin was a protein that had failed in clinical trials before. It originally was tested against obesity. And VCs don't like repurposing efforts a lot, either because of the IP issues that they may have thought that might be associated with it, or other. So that was another obstacle that we had to overcome. Repurposing efforts have led to some tremendous successes over the years, and a lot of people realize that there's a de-risking aspect working with repurposed efforts. You have a tremendous amount of data regarding safety from the other indication. Yet, that was another hurdle. And of course, me doing it for the first time, although that was never really challenged, that was never, because the immediate response was the team here is, we have very experienced individuals. We have a team that is very seasoned and top of the top. So so overall, that was some of the issues that we faced.
Okay. Okay. Thanks for that clarity. So thanks very much for your candor and insights today, Nick.
Thank you. Thank you for providing the opportunity to tell a story.
You're very welcome. Now, everybody, in closing, let's focus on the single fact that you just heard from Nick, and that is businesses don't become extraordinary in a single moment. Instead, they get there as a result of the owner first creating a visionary strategy, second, having a system of management to execute that strategy, and number 3, leveraging high performance teams. Now, you can find out exactly how to do those. Just go for free to my YouTube channel called Business Mastery Pro. So thanks for listening, and thanks, Nick, once again for sharing your time with us today.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Bill.